Hello, my name is Tammy Merrill. I have chosen for my vulnerable population the auditory impairment, people who are deaf. Definition of deaf is the inability to hear sound. There's a wide range. Some people just have mild hearing loss, goes all the way to profound, where they can't hear anything at all. This population is vulnerable in many ways that I have learned even more of in this preparation for this assignment. They are lacking quality education. They are more likely to not be employed or get the training that they need. They're discriminated against, more likely not on purpose, just people are afraid and don't know how to interact with them. Isolation from others, especially during this pandemic, is a real problem. And they have marginalization of healthcare. Even though our whole society has had great advances in healthcare, that healthcare is unevenly distributed. And these marginalized groups, such as people who are deaf have the highest risk of poor health outcomes. So this was very interesting, the profile of the population. I found this information, most of it on the U.S. Census Bureau website. And Davis County, where I live, has a 2.6%. 2.6% of our population is deaf. The state of Utah is just a little higher, 2.8%. Nationally, it goes up a little bit higher, and then internationally, the world population takes quite a jump. I could give this credit to myself for coming up with this, but I was reading in the World Health Organization says that some children are simply born deaf. However, many incidents of deafness could be prevented with proper medical care, treating and screening for otitis media, immunizations if moms were immunized for rubella before pregnancy, also immunizing children against childhood diseases, measles, mumps, meningitis, rubella. Simple things like hygiene. You prevent cytomegalovirus because of that, and being careful when you garden. Just screening and treating syphilis and other pregnancy infections. So that's a big deal. Also, it's really important that we teach noise education to all people. A lot of people become deaf because of listening too loud of music or on the job. Their training, their work, their employment, they have to work around loud noises, and they eventually go deaf. I went to the doctor probably 10 years ago. He told me I was losing the range in my hearing up in the high pitch range and he asked me about my blow dryer usage, and I told him I did use a blow dryer all the time, and he said that I needed to wear earplugs because the blow dryer next to my ear was causing damage to my hearing. Okay, so for the social determinants of health, the ones that I chose, there were many that would fit up with the deaf population. The ones that I chose are availability of resources to gain education and their quality of education and training, their access to educational, economic, and job opportunities, their language and literacy, we'll talk more about that, their socioeconomic conditions, we'll talk more about that later, but the main point is that they do have a lower income level than the rest of society, and access to healthcare services. Some contributing factors. So some of the items that I chose, psychosocial, isolation and loneliness is a very big one, especially as I mentioned during this pandemic. Economic, they do have lower employment rates, more likely to have low income. Emotionally, these deaf people are unable to get the nuances of conversation. They miss out on a lot of what's being said because of the inflection and the intonation in our voices. They miss out on a lot of meaning to what they're hearing, what they see. The physical concerns are, one of them would be safety. If they do drive, if a deaf person drives, he may not hear sirens coming behind him. Any deaf person, just in their environment, it might not be as safe with just not being able to hear what's going on around them. The contributing factors and the root causes. This is something that just really fascinated me. I was talking to my husband, and we decided that basically the world we live in is a world of communicating verbally. And so these people miss out in all kinds of ways, in their education, in their employment, in their relationships, and in their health. The thing is most of us don't know what we don't know. And deaf people, that's even more of a challenge for them because they're missing out on so much when they can't hear. In one of the articles I read, it was fascinating. It talked about children who are deaf who have a lack of incidental learning. The reason there's a train on this screen is because one day when I was riding home on the train from school from Ogden, I saw and heard this cute little mom, and she had her little 2-year-old, 18-month to 2-year-old daughter with her. And the mom was just pointing everything out of the window to her daughter. Oh, look, there's a barn. Oh, look at the birds. And the little girl was fascinated and so well behaved all the way when I was on the train with them. And that to me is incidental learning, when we just talk and interact with children. And also incidental learning is conversations that happen when the children aren't necessarily engaged in the conversation, but they have the opportunity just to listen in on a conversation. And this is something that children who are deaf, that doesn't really happen very easily. You have to make a very deliberate effort to have incidental learning with children who are deaf. So as far as Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I felt like the physiological needs were met. However, I felt like there were some areas of safety that were not. The security of the body, I learned, we'll talk about that in a minute. Their health, we'll talk about also. Also, I was concerned about esteem. Sometimes deaf people may not be respected by others simply because others don't understand them and don't know how to interact with them. And on the self-actualization level, because of their opportunities for learning, they may not be able to problem solve quite as easy, and they also inadvertently, as I mentioned before, may have people who feel prejudiced towards them. This section on communicable diseases was actually quite surprising to me. I thought that I was just going to be able to type, "This is not a problem for the deaf people." But as I read and studied, I learned that yes, this is also a problem for deaf people because of the lack of resources in American Sign Language, the sexual education resources. They do have a higher likelihood of communicable diseases. And because of that marginalization, they miss out on information that should be given to everyone. They don't always get it. And they also, for instance, my next door my neighbor, she's told me that when she goes to the doctor, she doesn't understand what they're telling her. Fortunately, her husband goes to her appointments with her, and he gets the idea. but it's frustrating to her that she can't understand what the doctors are telling her. Also, this is sad, but the child abuse and intimate partner violence are higher among deaf people, and that may also lead to communicable diseases. Here's another area that of non-communicable diseases. Mental health is a big issue. Depression, loneliness, anxiety, isolation. Once again, the suicidal behavior and substance use disorder is higher among the deaf population than among hearing people. They have a lower health literacy and poorer access to non-communicable disease prevention information. For instance, they may have a higher incidence of diabetes and heart and cardiac issues because they're not given the preventative information that they need, or they aren't able to understand it. And so that's a big one. That's once again the marginalization of healthcare for them. So specific concerns, there are many that we've discussed. I think right now during the pandemic, isolation, which leads to anxiety and depression, and it could lead to suicide also. That's probably the most concerning right now for me. The way to alleviate these are to reach out and to not be afraid of people who can't hear. Some know how to read lips, some know sign language. They can figure out ways to communicate. So we need to educate ourselves about the deaf culture, and we need to help engender just feelings of belonging. I love the idea of teaching parents to be deliberate about incidental learning, or talking to your children in sign language while you're having your dinner conversation, including children in those kinds of conversations all the time, telling them what you see out the window by using sign language or reading lips. And I had the opportunity to speak to a speech therapist at the local Bolton Elementary down by my house, and she said she hasn't worked with profoundly deaf students, but she has worked with children who are partially deaf. And one of the things that they teach, one of the things that she teaches is self-advocacy. She teaches them to say to people, "Will you please face me so I can read your lips?" Or, "Will you please talk louder so I can hear you? I'm partially deaf." The risk for concerns for harm, of course, that's the child abuse, intimate partner violence. There's a conflict now between parents. Like some think, oh, if my child's getting a cochlear implant, I shouldn't teach him American Sign Language. But that's a problem because there's a certain time frame when children can learn. And if they aren't learning some kind of language in their early years, then they won't understand any kind of language later on. So we need to be supportive of entities that educate the deaf and be inclusive and help find ways to communicate with them. Helen Keller's quote is priceless. "Blindness cuts us off from things, but deafness cuts us off from people." I think that if we can understand that and be more diligent in including the deaf population into our regular lives and making incidental learning part of their life, we can better help the deaf population. All right, here's my references. Thank you.